This is going to give us a chance to discuss Node.js and practice implementing Node.js servers. We're going to use Node.js as a middle tier that's going to live right in between some JavaScript running on a server and an Angular client. Right, so we're going to have some Angular components that we built already in the previous assignment that are going to use some Angular service clients that are going to use HTTP AJAX to talk to a server middle tier. Right, that up to this point, all middle tiers were built using Java. We're going to try and do the same thing, but using Node.js. They're going to be receiving several HTTP GET, POST, PUTs, and so on and so forth that is going to be handled by a Node.js middle tier. Is going to use a service to access data from a data source. For now, our data source is going to be a simple JSON file that's going to contain arrays of quizzes and questions and answers and whatnot. And the Node.js service is just going to be a simple set of functions that are going to implement a CRUD, several CRUD operators. Although, since this is the use cases for students, they're all mostly going to be read-only operations, so they're going to be able to retrieve quizzes, retrieve questions, answers, and whatnot from a JSON array. And then they're going to be exposed as a RESTful API using Node.js, the Express module. Next week, we're going to replace this data source with a MongoDB non-relational database. Right. So the focus for this week is to add a Node Express middle tier that's going to allow us to access a list of quizzes from a data source. Right. And what we're going to build is that we're going to extend the current course table or course list or however we called it last assignment. We're going to add links at the end of each one of the courses that if you click on those quizzes, it's going to navigate to a separate screen that's going to list all the quizzes for that course. Okay, and then if you click on a particular quiz, right, the link of a quiz or the start button for that quiz, it's going to navigate you to another screen that's going to render the questions in that quiz. Right, there's going to be two types of questions in the quiz that quiz supports, either a multiple choice or a true/false question. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to extend the course list and add the links, right? And we're going to navigate to a new component that you're going to build for this assignment. Is going to be called the quizzes component, right? We're going to declare a brand new route in our routing module, and then we're going to add links to the course list. When you click on the course list on the quizzes, this is an example on how you would implement that hyperlink, right? It notice that it would trigger the yes. Oh, thank you. Oh, you can't see my screen? That's not. All right. Can you see my screen? All right. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Right. So for this assignment, you're going to be building a new component called quizzes component, right? That is going to render a list of quizzes for a given course, right? When you click on the quizzes link, it navigates to the quizzes component. So when you click on the quizzes link, right, it activates this this URL, this route, right, and it renders the quizzes component. And here's an example of how you might implement the list of links for the quizzes, and then in the quizzes component, you can go and use a service, a quiz service client, right? That is going to have a function find all quizzes, which is going to go out to a server and retrieve all those quizzes from a RESTful API, right? Then the quizzes is going to be assigned to a local quizzes array, which we can then iterate over and render them as a list. Here's an example on how you would iterate over the list of quizzes, right, to render any number of li items, one per quiz. Each line item is going to contain two hyperlinks. One is going to be this title hyperlink right here, and then the second hyperlink is going to be rendered as a button, right? But both are going to be mapped to this URL, right? So that if you click on either the title of the quiz or the start button, is going to activate this route, which is courses, course ID, quizzes, and then the quiz ID. Okay. When you click on that, it's going to activate this route, right? Courses, course ID, quizzes, quiz ID, right? And it's going to activate a brand new component called quiz component. The quiz component is going to render a list of questions. So it's going to go out to a server, right? Here's the component. It's going to go out to a server using a question service client, right? It's going to find the questions for that quiz. If you give it the quiz ID, it'll fetch the questions for that quiz. And then the questions, you can assign them to a local array of questions and then iterate over each one of the questions, right? So as you iterate over the question, right, the questions are going to be have a field called type. And the type are either going to be a multiple choice type question or a true-false type question, right? So as it's iterating over the questions, right, it's going to use a brand new Angular attribute called ng-switch, which based on the type of the question, it's either going to render a multiple choice question or it's going to render a true-false question implemented in two new components, two new Angular components, either the multiple choice component or the true-false component, right, using this ng-switch and the ng-switch case. Also new in this this week, we're going to pass a reference to the question that we're iterating over. We're going to pass it down to each one of the components using an attribute called question. Okay. So that it can render the question inside of that component. All right. So the brand new question components, we're going to have a true/false question component, which is this one, right? The true/false question component, right? Which is going to render. Is going to have the following behavior. It's this one right here, the true/false component, right? By default, it renders the true/false unselected. But if you select either true or false, and it will show on your answer, the one that you selected, it will show the answer that you selected down here. So it'll show first the question at the top as a title, right? Then the options, and then your selected answer here. If you click on grade, it'll grade that individual question, right? Not the whole quiz. It'll grade that individual question, and then it'll highlight saying whether it was selected correct or not. Right, so if it's true, right, and your answer matches the correct answer, it highlights it green and it puts a checkbox next to the answer. Next to the option and the question. If it's wrong, right, then your answer it highlights the answer, the wrong answer that you selected, put an X at the end, and then an X at the next to the question. Okay, so that's the behavior for that. Here's an example on the TypeScript for that question. Notice that it's receiving the question as an attribute from, as you're iterating over the question, you're passing a reference of the question down to the component. So to receive it as a reference, we use the this annotation input, right? The input annotation, as a saying that this is a reference being passed as an attribute. The multiple choice question. So the multiple choice question is a little bit it's a generic version or more general version of the true/false question, right? In the true/false question, you only have two options, true and false. Whereas the multiple choice is it's a general case where you don't have just true/false. You can have any number of options. Okay. And here we have 4 options which are rendered as radio buttons. And in multiple choices, they are mutually exclusive, right? So if selecting one, will unselect all the other ones. So the way it behaves is that it puts the question at the top of the title, and then iterates over the list of options as radio buttons, and they're mutually exclusive. And when you select one, it shows your answer down here in your answer. If you click on grade, if it's correct, if your answer is the correct one, it highlights it green, right, and put a checkbox next to the title. If it's wrong, it highlights it red, right, and puts an X next to your answer and the title as well. It shows also the correct answer as well. So here's an example of what it might look like, right? Also notice that these buttons, the grading button, they're bound to this function grade, which toggles or sets a grading variable. It sets to true so that you can drive the logic of whether you're going to highlight or not highlight these checkboxes and these radio buttons. All right, so that's the front end, right? That's the front end. Now the front end needs to be able to talk to a back end, right? The middle tier. To do that, you're going to create services that are going to be able to communicate with a middle tier, to be able to retrieve all the quizzes, right, or retrieve an individual quiz given a quiz ID. Also, to be able to retrieve the questions in a separate service, right, we're going to have a find questions for quiz where you can provide the quiz ID and then it'll retrieve the questions for that particular quiz, right? Also remember that any services that you declare need to be also registered as providers in the app.modules, right, so that they can be injected into other components. All right, so that is all the front end, right? The front end talking to the middle tier. Now the middle tier, right, we're going to be using Node.js to implement the middle tier. We're going to have hard-coded arrays of quizzes and questions in separate JSON files. So for instance, in quizzes.json, we're going to have an array of quizzes, right, with their own IDs and titles and whatnot. We're going to implement a service, right, the quiz service, which is going to allow us to access or read that file, right? We're going to read it we're going to read this array into a local variable, and then provide finder methods, right, to retrieve either all the quizzes or retrieve a particular quiz knowing its ID. We're going to use module exports to export it so that other files in Node.js are going to be able to import these files and use them to read all the data. So that service is going to be paired with a controller that is going to expose that data model through a RESTful service, right? It's going to receive two getter URLs, right? One for retrieving all the quizzes and another one for retrieving an individual quiz, right, given the ID. Right, here's an example of what that controller might look like, right? It's going to expose, it's going to use app. App is going to be an instance of the express module, right, that allows us to respond to HTTP request, get, post, put, delete, right? And here we are responding to a get to this particular URL, right, which is using the service to retrieve all the quizzes and then is sending it back to the client. This one is retrieving a particular quiz by its ID and then responding with that one quiz. Same thing for the question service. We're going to be able to retrieve all the questions from a JSON file. Right? This JSON is an example of the JSON file that we're going to be able to retrieve all the quizzes, all the questions for a given quiz. Right? We're going to pass the quiz ID and retrieve all the questions for the quiz. Okay. Anyway, so that's the middle tier. Finally, we're going to take those two controllers and we're going to load them into a server file, into a server.js file, which is going to implement our Node.js server. It's going to grab those two controllers. It's going to configure also cores, right? Because you're going to have Angular running on one server in one domain, trying to communicate with another domain, right, where you have your Node.js running, right? So that communication usually would be hindered, right? Because browsers don't allow JavaScript to communicate with domains that are not from where they were downloaded. So we need to, open up that origin so other folks can communicate that were not from the same domain. Anyway, for deliverables, As always, we're going to need links to all your GitHub repositories. So please provide links to your brand new Node.js GitHub repository, your existing Angular repository, both of your Git repositories. Also, we'll need links to both of these projects deployed on Heroku, right? So your Angular project deployed on Heroku, as well as your brand new Node.js Heroku also deployed on Heroku. Okay. All right. So that's the assignment for this week.